If you need to figure out how to set up and configure Contentful CMS and then wire it up to the brand new app router in Next 13 Plus, then I recommend you watch the next 15 minutes of this video. In this video, I'm going to cover topics including CMS setup, the differences between app and page router, as well as creating a working website that you can use to build your own projects. Now, before we get to the good stuff, I should point out that if you want to master Contentful CMS, I've created a book all on Contentful development, and it's only 15 bucks. So the link to that book is in the description below. And because we're on YouTube, obviously, if you appreciate the time it takes for me to do this video, then tap on the like button, click on subscribe, leave me a little comment because it makes me feel all good and warm and fuzzy inside. So with that said, we're now going to figure out how to hook up Contentful CMS. I'm going to start off this section by providing you with some advice that I wish I had when I was trying to get AppRouter and Contentful working. And this is going to be really useful for people new to Next.js. Now, one important thing to know is that there's multiple ways of doing the same thing in Next.js. Now, in order to deal with routing in Next.js 12 and below, we only had the page router to use. And depending on if we wanted to have our code execute on the server or in the client, e.g. SSR, server-side rendering or static site generation, SSG, we would configure Next.js appropriately. However, as of v13, we now have App Router. Now, when it comes to mastering App Router, an important thing to keep in mind is that the way that we structure our projects now has changed. So a really useful thing that I recommend that you keep in your head when you're trying to get Contentful to play nicely with Next.js and App Router is that the code that you find online has been likely written to work with page router. This means that when you get stuck, you try and copy something and you paste it into your solution, the chances are that code will blow up. Now, the reason why that code blows up is not likely between the integration between Contentful and Next.js. It's because you're trying to copy page router stuff inside of your app router project. And this is the reason why I think it's really important to understand the difference in project structure now between app router and page router, because this is going to make your life much easier when you start looking at documentation and reading code examples. So with that said, let's look at those differences right now. Okay, so this on screen is an example of a Next.js website that makes use of the page router. Now, the first thing that I want to point out is this pages folder. And if I expand it, you can see that all the pages that map to all the content models in Contentful, they're all going to live within this folder. Now, when you're using the app router, this pages folder will not exist. And instead, you're going to have to create a folder called app. Excuse my bad writing. Now, if you look within this pages folder, you can see that we've got a bunch of page components. And basically the name of each of these files is going to map to the URL. So let's say my website is called website.com, then website.com/profile will get to this page. And if we just want to have a home page, we're going to call it index.js. So quickly jumping us into the feature within our app router example, you can see here that this same homepage is now called page.js instead of index.js. Now, this process of creating a file for every single page on your website isn't really scalable. Now, the approach is brilliant if you've got a few pages whose URL will never change. So for example, the homepage is always going to be at the root. You might have a contact us page whose URL will never change, and it's got a very specific template. Now, for these examples, you'll create an individual file class inside your project, and then within that file, you'll need to write some code to talk to Contentful and get the information about that page. Now, for this example I'm building today, I'm going to create a blog. Now, the issue with blogs is that a content editor can go into Contentful, they can create any blog they want. The URL is going to be dynamic, so we can't predict it when we're writing our code. And because we can't predict the URLs, we're going to need a way to deal with dynamic URLs. Now, I am going to show you how to hook all of this up with Contentful and Next.js in a bit, But the important thing I just want to focus on now is that when you want to create one of these dynamic routes, in the page router, you would create a folder within your pages directory. Within here, you'll then use these curly braces to denote that this was something using a dynamic route. Then basically within each of these components, you would have to implement a method like get static paths and off you go. Now within the new world, the thing to point out is that we can create these folders and we put our curly braces within our folder structure. So we've got the news page here, we've got slug in our curly braces, and then we use page here. And you need to use a format similar to this if you start encountering 404 pages when you're trying to set up your dynamic routes. Now, in my opinion, they're probably the main things you need to keep an eye out for when you need to copy code online. The next thing we should probably do is actually go through our app and have a look at all the different contentful settings that you need to put in Next.js. Now, in order to get Next.js and Contentful to talk to each other, as you'd probably expect, you're going to need to add in some settings. And in Next.js, we're going to add in our settings within an environment variable. Probably no surprise there. Now, in order to do the basics of just get content from a CMS into Next.js, the 3 environment variables that you'll need to think about are first, the Contentful space ID. So this is the area within Contentful that you're adding your content. The next thing is the access token, and the access token is for security. So you don't want any Tom, Dick or Harry from accessing your headless API. So we're going to lock it down with an access token. And then the final thing is the environment. So within Contentful, you can have a staging, a pre-production, a development environment, and we just want to pull content from master. Okay, so now let's quickly look at how we get all that data from Contentful. So if I go to the top here, you can see we've got our burger menu, and you can see the environment. So you want to copy this one here, or the environment that you want to use. Now, in order to get your access tokens, go over to settings, and then within settings, you can see we've got API keys. So within this API key bit, you basically click on this API key. I'm going to do example. And then from in here, you can see that we can give our access token a name. Then we're going to get the space ID. You can also find the space ID within the URL here. And then you can see here, we've got our content delivery API access token, and we've got the content preview API access token, and we've got the environment we want to associate the key read to. Now, the second area in this environment variable is around preview. And I'm not going to cover preview in too much detail here because I've created a video all about preview and how to set it up. And you can find that in the related tutorial below. But quickly, you're going to have a separate access token for preview. You're going to have a secret and a revalidation secret just to make sure that all your data is secure. And then you're also going to have to think about the Contentful preview host, which is preview.contentful.com. So that covered all the settings that you need to worry about. And the next thing I want to talk about is security. Now, because we're using a headless CMS, when content editors upload images inside of Contentful, they're going to have a Contentful domain. Now, because you're building a headless website, which will have your own local domain, this means that some of your images might not load properly because of CORS restrictions. So the next thing we need to set up in our next config file is to whitelist the Contentful domain so all of our assets can be displayed within our headless website. So I've loaded my nextconfig.mjs file over here, and in the top, the first thing we're going to do is whitelist the images.ctfassets.net. So this is Contentful's assets domain, and we need to do this, otherwise you're going to bump into a CORS issue when you try to render images. Now, because we're in this next config file, it's probably also a good idea just to quickly remind you about preview. Now, within Contentful, there's a live preview, so you can see your page as you're editing it in the CMS. Now, because we're working between different domains, this preview will not work unless you add in a CORS policy in your site to whitelist the Contentful domain. So let's quickly look at how we can add in that content security policy now. So within next config, we're going to add in an async headers function. Within here, we're going to add in our source, which is path. We're going to add in a header, And from here, we're going to add in two different entries. So we're going to add in the X-frame options, the same origin. And we're also going to set a content security policy with frame ancestors of self. And then we're going to add in the contentful domain here, which is app.contentful.com. Now, personally, I've built a bunch of websites that integrate Contentful and Next.js. And if I'm honest, the only times when things have really gone wrong is when I've messed up one of the steps in the previous section. So as long as you make sure you get all the stuff right that I've just covered, then this section should be a breeze. And the first thing we need to do is obviously create some data within the CMS itself. So after you log back inside of the CMS, your first task is to do the content modeling. And you can do that within this tab here, which is called Content Model. Now, just in case you're new to CMS development, content modeling is the process of taking your designs and your wireframes, and then within the CMS, creating these data models that content editors can then use in order to create content. Now, for this example, I'm just going to focus on the blog post itself. So you can see here that I've created an entry called post. And if I click on this, you can see it's structured using a title, a summary, a slug, an excerpt, a cover image, a date, an author, and an external URL. Now, within this field type column here, you can see I made these up from short text, long text, short text, short text. The cover image is media, the date is a date, the author is a reference, and this is its own content model. And I've also got an external URL. Now, in order to add in and edit things, you can see I can click on this add field, and you can see we've got all the different options here. Now, if we just look at what that looks like in the end world, you can see here I've got this very simple what is time management post. So this has got a title. We've got the summary. You can see here this is what the rich text editor looks like. Underneath here you can see we've got a slug. So this is going to be the URL. We've got an excerpt. We've got our image picker so we can render out images. And this is the reason why we needed to whitelist that core stuff. Then underneath here, we've got our date picker, an author, which is me, and our external URL. Now, one quick tip that I would give you is that when you're doing your content modeling, if you click on this visual modeler button, you're going to get a visual representation of all the different content models you've created within your space. Now, if I zoom in, that's probably zooming in too much, you'll see that I can find my post one in here, hopefully. If I expand it, you can see all the different properties, what it's made up of. Now, a handy tip is that if you click on this edit mode button, you'll see that I can now edit this post in here. So if I click on open, you can see that I can actually add in fields and I can pick all that kind of good stuff. I can also click on this button and use generative AI to actually create all the content models for me. So, yep, I've already jumped us back to VS Code because really that's everything you need to do in the CMS. Create a content model, create some content, publish it, and then we're good to go. Now, the first thing I quickly want to show you is the packages you need to make sure you've got installed. So this will allow you to get the data from the CMS. Now, if you want to get the live preview to work, you're going to have @contentful/live preview installed. If you want to use the rich text field, you're going to have to install this Contentful rich-text-react-renderer. Now, the reason why you need this is because if you just try and render out the rich text property directly on your page, it won't be formatted. It's going to look stupid. You're going to see a bunch of JSON instead of nicely formatted HTML. So you need this. And finally, you need the Contentful npm package because this is going to contain all the helpers to call the CMS. Now, after we've done all of that, if I go back into my solution, the first thing we'll probably need to do is create a homepage. Now, I won't go into this in too much detail, but basically within my app folder, remember app and not pages, I'm going to create a homepage, and this is going to be called page.js. And then within my page.js, you can see I've got this export default async function home. Now, for this very simple example, I haven't created a homepage within the CMS. If I go through the HTML here, you can see the only thing that I'm really doing is getting a list of all the blog posts which have been created inside of the CMS, and then I render them out using these two components, or three components. Now, just in case you're struggling to visualize what that end web page may look like based on that code, let's quickly go over it. Now, this is my homepage and I've launched it locally. And you can see the first thing on this page is the latest blog post that's been created within that blog post type, the post type there. Now underneath, I'm loading in every single one of my posts created, and this is being pulled in using GraphQL, which we'll get to next. Underneath here, I've also got another example of just pulling in this data using REST API. Now, the nice thing within Contentful, you can choose how you access your data from the CMS. So GraphQL and REST. Now, for this example, and if you want to get the preview to work, I recommend that you use GraphQL because this is going to make the live preview update all nicely. But if you just want to see the different ways, then you can download my sample site in the description below to look at the REST API way of doing things if you want to. Okay, so jumping us back to page.js, our homepage, let's have a look at how we can actually get data from the CMS at a code level. Now remember, my homepage is getting data using the REST API and Graph, and remember, I only recommend you look at GraphQL. So we're going to ignore all the REST SDK code here. So in order to get data, I've created this library and I've stuck it in lib/contentful/GraphQL SDK. So this is something I've created myself. Now, the essence of this file is that I'm getting the posts, I'm then rendering them out onto the page, and I'm passing into these two components as I showed you a minute ago. Now, if I click on Get All Posts, you'll see the first thing we're doing here is structuring my GraphQL query. Now, when it comes to your website, you may struggle to figure out the syntax that you need to write in order to query your own custom models within the CMS. Now, one quick tip which will make your life easier here is that if you go back into CMS, if you go to apps here, and if you go to the marketplace, from this page, if you do a search for the GraphQL, you'll find this GraphQL Playground Marketplace app. So this is free to download. Once you install it, you'll see the GraphQL Playground within your app list. And then when you click on it, you're going to get a GraphQL Explorer. Now, the nice thing about this is you can then actually use some IntelliSense. And from here, you can figure out what you need to query. You can test it. And then once you've got your query, you can simply copy and paste it into your code. Now, when you're creating one of your queries, one important step that a lot of people forget, and a lot of people moan about headless websites because of this, is the trade-off between performance and maintainability. So by this, I mean that let's say that we want to render a content model. As a developer, you'll probably only want to expose the exact bits of data that will be required to render that property. Now, the issue with this is that if a content editor wants to change something in the CMS and they want to expose a different field, your problem now is that you'll have to do a code release in order for them to be able to update stuff in the CMS. And this means that development becomes a blocker and everyone gets angry. So a good tip is to actually return all the items from your content model, render them out, and then hide them if they're not used, because this is going to give you much more maintainability and it means you're going to have to do less code releases in the future. So with that said, let's get back to the code and figure out what's going on in this file. So remember, we've got get all posts and it's making a call to fetch GraphQL. So this is a function I've created. It's async. And you can see here that we're passing in the GraphQL query we want to use as a parameter. So looking at this, you can see that we're passing in the query. I'm doing a fetch. And in order to query the GraphQL endpoint, we're calling graphql.contentful.com/content/v1/spaces, and we're passing in our space ID. Now underneath here, we're passing in some metadata. So we're saying a method of post. We're saying the HTTP headers. We've got a content type of application JSON. We need to add in our access token. So authorization, bearer, and then we're going to pass in either the preview access token or the production access token. Again, we set these in our environment variables. Underneath, we now need to guess our query, and then using JSON.stringify, we're going to convert it to some text and then append it to the body of the request. And then we can also do these tags, but I'm not going to use it here. And then all I'm doing is getting this JSON and returning it. So this GraphQL query, fairly simple, but the benefit is that, once we've got this query here, we're going to get all of our data. Now, one thing that I haven't shown is this post GraphQL fields. Now, when you're working in a class, if you need to write different functions that query the CMS for the same content model, then instead of duplicating all of your GraphQL queries over and over again, it's much better to define a single object and then reference that throughout your class. And this is the reason why at the top of this file, I've got this post underscore graph underscore fields, and this is going to define everything in that post type that I want to get returned every single time that I need to query the CMS. So quickly looking at it, you can see I've got the sys ID. So this is the item's unique ID. I've got the underscore underscore type name, which is the content model type. And then underneath here, these are all the properties that I've defined on my content model that I want returned. And then going back to our get or posts, you can see that I'm passing in this constant as part of my query. And then all I'm doing is returning all the data so I can use it in my home page or my blog page in a second. So we're definitely on the closing stretch now. And the last thing I quickly want to talk about is how we deal with dynamic URLs. So as content editors are going into CMS, they're creating new posts. When we write our code, we won't know ahead of time what those URLs are. So we need a way to automatically deal with dynamic routing in our application. Now, in order to do this, you can see that in my app folder here, I've got these folders. Now, I've got this one called post underscore graph underscore page. In the real world, you're probably going to just call yours post or news or whatever it might be, blogs. And in here, you can see I've got another folder, and this has got a square bracket. It's called slug, and then it's got another ending closing bracket. And then within here, I've got page.js. So remember, that's the default root. Now, when we come in here, all the code is very similar to what you've seen already. Now, in terms of the routing, the main standout piece that we need to make note of is this generate static params. So this is a app router specific function, and it can be used in combination with dynamic route segments to statically generate routes at build time instead of on demand. So within this method, what we need to do is call the CMS, get every single blog type, and then add its URL into the allowed URL list. This means that when a request gets made, this page is going to get converted into HTML, and we can then render it out as needed. Now, within this example, you can see that we've got a slug. The slug's being passed in as a param here, and then within the code itself, I'm getting the individual information about that page from Contentful using this get post. So in essence, in this file, we're doing two queries to the CMS. One, to get every single allowed URL that we're going to render, and then the second one within the actual component itself to get data about that page. Now, assuming that you have everything set up correctly, when you try and access your page, you can see here we've got post graph page, and then we've got editing basics. So if we jump back to the solution, you'll now see where this post graph page comes in. This makes part of the segment in the URL, and then the actual page type itself, editing basics. This is the value that a content editor has put in that slug property within the CMS. So that really is everything that you need to know in order to get a basic site up and running with Contentful and Next.js using App Router. Now, if you have got value from this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Show me some love because it takes me ages to do these videos. Also, if you do want to know how to set up the preview, then on the screen right now is the link to that preview video that I mentioned. So click on that because it's very interesting. Otherwise, I hope you have an amazing week, and until next time, happy coding.